Thank you very much for that introduction, Professor Sia, and President and members. It's lovely to be with you today, and it's been a really lot of fun to see you in action, and I hope I can share some interesting things today. So I'll just check where it all go. Yep. So today I want to look at this issue of whether young people are engaged, and in particular I want to consider these questions. What do we currently know about youth engagement? Are they active or apathetic? Both international patterns and within New Zealand. And then I want to really say we perhaps need to move beyond these debates, but what would they be if we moved beyond these two binary positions? And then drawing on a project I've just finished with 2 years of research in high schools, I'm looking at what educational strategies could lead to long-term engagement, drawing on the research I've done in one particular area of senior social studies. So just to that first question, there is a lot of discussion today about whether youth are engaged, and in fact this election, I think there's been a greater focus on youth engagement than many other times, possibly because of the arrival of Jacinda Ardern with a more youthful end of the spectrum, but also there's been a lot of groups lobbying to get more young people out and voting. And this is largely in response to some quite sobering figures that give some weight to the idea of young people being more apathetic, but I'm going to play around with this idea, that show over the last basically 10 years in particular, if you look at that graph there from the 1990s, there's been a rapid decline in many of the Western democracies of the world. Anyone know why Australia maintains that average it does? Compulsory. So don't need to tell you about Australia. But New Zealand has had a particularly rapid decline in the 1990s from 89% voter turnout in 1981 to 69% of those eligible to enrol in 2011. And 2011 was the lowest recorded New Zealand parliamentary election since the adoption of universal suffrage in 1893. In 2014 it went up slightly, 72%. And it is still above some others. Canada and America is actually down nearly at 50%, with a small blip around Obama. But we have, New Zealand has generally maintained a very high average rate of participation. But it has been an issue that has become more apparent, and it does appear to be linked to youth. Maybe not just the 18 to 24-year-old gap, because you can see in this graph here, the blue is 2008, the red is 2011, and the green is 2014, and in every subsequent year the rate of enrolment by age group has fallen over that time. And interestingly, the group not enrolling are actually, it seems to be going up through the ages, even right into the 30s. So that graph would show us that the issue of youth engagement possibly doesn't just relate to the youngest end, which would be 18 to 24, but actually stretches into the 30s. And this pattern is mirrored over many, if not most, Western democracies of the world now. So it does raise some questions that are confirmed by other rates of falling engagement, which are particularly seen in things like political party membership, which has fallen rapidly to only about 3% in 2002, decline in donations to political parties, decline in members of associations, unions, church attendance since the 1980s, and a recent study of New Zealand 14-year-olds found very low expectations of political involvement in the future. They had about 85% expectation to vote, but to become a member of a party was very low. So something's going on, and this all has changed since about the early 90s. One other thing we do know, and this actually doesn't represent the pattern I've just shown you, which is of a lot of declining engagement, is that young people actually have high levels of civic knowledge, and schools are often hit up for being responsible for having no civics education and producing poor quality citizens. But actually in the last international study New Zealand participated in, New Zealand students had good, really high rates of engagement in things like engagement in political party or a union compared with other groups, an ethnic organisation. This is where our kura kaupapa and our kapa haka and all these groups that the young people belong to actually have an international significance compared to other countries. And volunteering, we have very high rates of New Zealand students volunteering in the community. So what we know is that young people don't rank before they leave school in a particularly bad way. They had lower results of affiliation with environmental, human rights and campaigning for an issue down the bottom there. But on an international average, they were very high in actual participation in volunteering and so on. When it came to their civic knowledge, New Zealand students knew a lot, and they were on the same level as countries like Norway in terms of their civic knowledge around the world. And high levels of engagement in the classroom to discuss issues and so on. So what this shows is quite a complicated pattern that we actually have quite a lot of interesting things happening if we care to look at what's happening with young people. So there's been a lot of talk about the new kind of engagements that young people might be involved in social media and online, and there is evidence, of course, that this has increased in recent years with the technology associated. And so we have a lot of online blogging, social networks, and so on have grown and grown. And what some researchers, such as Anita Harris from Australia, argue is that young people have moved into the virtual space when their lives have become more complicated in real space. So young people do get hit up when they walk around town, often, asked to get out of the warehouse or where they're shopping if it looks like they're a problem. And one answer is to retreat to the virtual space where they have an equal level of participation as adults. So that's one argument put forward. And there's growth of boycotting products, which young people often do. There's a growth in veganism, which we're not quite sure why, and vegetarianism. Well, we do know a little bit why that's happening. But what I want to talk about is the cause and identity politics, which seem to be the marker of this generation much more than any previous generation. And these are political science theorists, Bang and Norris, who basically said you can see the rise of project, or what they call cause politics, and identity politics that don't fit the traditional ways of how we understand politics. And they're often quite micro-personal politics. They might be related to your gender identity or to things like veganism. So these lifestyle politics are on the rise. Or young people might just have one particular cause that they go for, and it might be, say, the TPPA, or it might be climate change. And they tend to be quite cause-oriented, but not necessarily politically oriented in the traditional sense. So this quote by Norris at the bottom, where people can see themselves as belonging simply by turning up or sharing political sympathies with an easy entry, easy exit, permeability of organisational boundaries, rather than formally joining. And what we do see is this type of approach where young people are less inclined to formally join. It may even be something like Rotary, I'm not quite sure if that would be the case, but a greater tendency to find an issue that they're passionate about and go for that issue rather than across the political spectrum. So political parties have really suffered because nobody wants to particularly affiliate, because actually I like the way Greens do this, I like the way National does this, I like the way Labour does this, but there's much less one type of political affiliation in the generation coming through. But they're defined more by causes and identity which relates to them. So I think this gives us some really interesting opportunities and also some really big challenges. And what I think one of the things we need to do is to move beyond the binaries which have been set up, whether young people are active or disengaged or apathetic, and actually look at what they are doing. Because if we take away those big definitions and start to say, okay, let's just see what they're doing without trying to label them, we end up with quite an interesting new scenario. And I've mostly coined this in my research around the idea of everyday citizenship. And what I find talking to, I would have interviewed, say, 350 young people personally in the last 7 years. What I find is there isn't one who doesn't have an issue that interests them. They all have issues that interest them. And it's a matter of, instead of saying, are you interested in politics, I won't get much feedback. If I say to them, what issues really make you mad? What issues do you want to fight for? What issues do you want to protect? They will almost 100% give me an answer of something that they really care for. So this tells me that often their state of awareness of the world is very high, They're engaged in issues, but they aren't necessarily along the same lines as traditional political participation looked like. So I've theorised that we need to look beyond our traditional expectations and look at how young people themselves consider their everyday levels of citizenship engagement. And this is mostly related to their everyday communities that they're in. So this question, what issues are you interested in, what are you doing about it? I have got huge amounts of data of what young people are actually doing. And my research, interestingly, is almost with students almost exclusively before they turn 18, which often they're viewed as not even politically aware at that stage. But I've found that the issues they're interested in are often highly relational, related to their cultures, their groups, their friends, very geographical, linked to where they live, and there is a bit of a civic gap with the more wealthy communities with a much bigger worldview than the poorer communities. Environmental actions are really big, but it might be as small as taking shorter showers or riding your bike to school, and these things would go beneath the radar of most people's measures of political participation. And volunteering is absolutely huge, and so most young people are doing something with sports teams, helping out, youth groups, churches, marae, and so on. So I think that with that in mind, we are now going to move beyond the critique of whether they're apathetic or engaged and actually look at what young people care about. So this is some research I did in Porirua, and the young people there, I gave them cameras and said, go into your community and tell me what is it you're interested about, what makes you feel you belong in this community, and therefore what would you want to take action on as a young citizen. And these were their kind of everyday pictures and experiences that they talked to me about. And you can see the list there of the things in my community which count. And they took photos of the old road, the way I walk home, my church, my school, the duck pond, marae, and places which mattered to them, which were places associated with cultural activities, skateboarding, music, church, and important people like friends and family. So once I found out the things they really cared about, I then said to them, what would you want to do to make a difference or change? And they identified very clearly the things which they had great concern about, such as the rubbish. They talked a lot about how sad they were at the tagging around their places, because it really offended their sense of belonging to what they viewed as an incredibly valuable community that had a huge sense of welcome to other people. Traffic was an issue, public transport. One student mentioned gangs, but the liquor stores came up time and time again, with the amount of liquor stores in a poorer community which seemed to be targeting youth. And these young people themselves said, we would do anything to get those out because it's our friends which are influenced in a really negative way. And they just wanted better facilities for their young people. And they took a picture of this facility down the bottom and they called it the cage because it was so caged in where the young people had to play. And they just said, we reckon our children deserve better playing facilities in our community. So when you hear young people speaking like that, and these were about age 15, 16-year-olds, you realise actually they do have issues that they're passionate about. They're not disengaged at all. And what had they done for some of these issues? They talked about just small things like planting trees, supporting something like the 40-hour famine, fundraising to try and get money for their community and charities. They did a lot of service in the community, like visiting the elderly, helping out with the youth group, with the choirs, and so on. Even going to school they saw as one of their social actions so that they could help their family improve their state. And there was this lovely sense that socialising with other people was actually a social action in itself, where they talked about cross-cultural interaction as a way of creating a better community to live in, because it was part of understanding who we are. And these were their definitions of how they saw themselves as young citizens. So with that in mind, I want to turn to the last focus of this talk, which is about what would it actually take to put in place a civic education program that worked really well for young people today? Because I think almost every political party has at some stage said we want more civics in schools, and Labour have come out and said they will do that. And I have some caution about that. As a social studies teacher, there are some amazing things already happening. Possibly we don't need a whole new curriculum. But I also have some cautions because the research shows us that these are the things, these 4 things here, over huge longitudinal studies, mostly from the US, that show that if young people had this in their schooling, it impacted on their long-term participation. And these are things like having an inclusive and democratic environment, which many schools do not have. They're often very hierarchical. A critically oriented classroom that allowed students to open up discussions about critical issues in society and have a dialogue about them. Students were allowed to study real-world issues which really mattered to them, and this is my own research which has contributed to this, that shows when you give students an issue which they burn for and that they really care about, they'll be passionate. But if you give them an issue which isn't theirs, they'll often feel quite offended to have to take action on something which is not their issue. And finally, being active when you're young has a huge contribution to being active when you're later. In other words, they need the practice of being citizens, not just something that's delayed in the future. So the kind of programs which get young people out there volunteering in the community and being involved appear to have the most significant impact on long-term engagement as citizens. So just to finish off, I want to talk to you about a new program in NCEA which came in a couple of years ago in 2013, which awarded young people credits for taking social action. This is quite unusual and almost no country in the world does it, but it's built into NCEA. And I went in to research this because I have to say I was a bit cynical. Should young people get credits for fundraising or something? But what I found is it was a hugely transformational program on the 92 young people I personally interviewed, and we did surveys as well. But it had to be quite genuine and authentic and not just shoved on them in a quick, short time frame. And mostly involved choosing an issue of their choice, undertaking some kind of action on it, and then reflecting on it. And one of the real gems is that your action could completely fail, but you could still get the credits because you could reflect deeply on why it might have failed. So this is quite a positive thing, because if you are involved in business or anywhere else, you know that the ability to fail is one of the greatest learning opportunities young people should have. So this one appeared to do it. So it was just a 2-year project funded by TLRI Research with 5 co-researchers who were in schools as teachers, and it was an amalgamation with Massey University to put it together. So when I interviewed young people, I said, what did you actually learn when you did these social actions? And they talked about learning about real life more than any other subject. It kind of tested your real life skills. You had to write a letter. And they probably put more time into it because it was useful later in life. They did a range of things, everything from fundraising through to educating themselves and others, raising awareness, particularly through social media, and then undertaking some kind of advocacy and lobbying at the higher level when they were in year 13. So, for example, one group held a massive refugee awareness day at their school. They brought in refugees to talk about their experiences and then asked young people to sign, if they wished, a letter to an MP to ask to raise the quota. This was in 2015, to allow refugees in. And they presented that to an MP and got good feedback about that. One group presented to the Select Committee on the Healthy Homes Bill, Andrew Little's bill, and a couple more groups have done that since, which is quite a scary experience for them, but they believed that they needed to share those ideas. One last example is some young girls who decided that female body image was a pretty big issue for girls their age, and so they created a really positive video that has had thousands of views just to encourage young girls to be proud of who they are. So these are examples of what's actually happening in schools now. About 5,000 students a year do this achievement standard, and it appears to be very positive. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure there's somebody with a question that's burning to John.
I was interested that you didn't really talk very much about homes and whether or not dysfunctional homes and family violence are an issue. So it's either a question whether your database, in other words, the people you talk to, were of that slightly more happy home situation, or whether it is a bit of a non-issue. I don't think it's a non-issue.
No, not a non-issue at all. I don't have the exact stats on whether it would be, how significant it would be, but what we do know is that there is quite a big disengagement of the young people from poorer backgrounds and very likely to be less stable backgrounds. That's often correlated. So I suspect that's significant.
Time for one more quick one. Anybody got another question?
Those who have gone through NCA at those three levels, have you done any analysis to know what level is assigned come from? Are they all schools or are they certain areas or not?
Yep, we did analyse that, and they do represent all schools. We're doing some longitudinal work on to see where they end up, which is underway this year. And actually, there's some small significant data to show that Māori and Pacific find the social action achievement standards, they score excellence in greater rates than almost any other. So it might mean that it engages with what they're doing already in their communities, or it could be quite appealing to more practical type students as well.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Sarah, I'll ask you to thank the speaker.
Dr. Brownyn, thanks for the speech. Now, what I actually take away from the speech is 3 bullet points here, to which I hope club members also have the same views as well. First is that we asked the question about whether we are thinking about youngsters being more active or apathetic, and you have actually enlightened us about the fact that we should be thinking about what is the definition of engagement, right? To which I think our engagement is whether they participate or join a party when it comes to politicians, but then we were being challenged on our thinking around that. And of course, in terms of that, you have also presented to us some statistics around what they care actually more, which I see as a micro foundations of what is being discovered. So you say things like they are interested in facilities, worried about safety, and care about transport. And some of these things, as we can always sort of elevate to a higher level, it becomes public policy issues to which, if they engage further, of course, over time, they will become more interested in politics and so forth. And a lot of the activities that you highlighted there tells us that it's probably easier to get them to be involved with the Rotary Club as opposed to the National Party or the Labour Party or whichever, so they like to be volunteers. And of course, in that, we need to do a lot more education around the citizenship as well as to incorporate into the curriculum. And so on behalf of the club, can we put our hands together and thank you for the nice speech there. And then also on behalf of the club, can I offer you a souvenir, to which I suspect is all about us. But more importantly, there's probably some discount vouchers to engage with us.
Thank you. That's really nice.
Thank you.